Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for that great introduction. So I won't be too duplicitous here, but just to say that, hi, I'm Jasmine, and I am so excited to get the opportunity to talk with all of you. I'm in Oregon today. I am zooming into from a little bit outside of Chicago, but I am a writer of books primarily for teens and for middle schoolers, and I feel so lucky that this is what I get to do, particularly because I love stories and I've always loved stories. And that's where I want to start today. So I think the number one thing I'm often asked by young readers is, did you always want to be a writer and how did you get into writing? And the truth is, I think I got into writing because of storytelling. And for me, writing is that mode of storytelling. And my love of storytelling, I can trace back to my grandmother. So this is a photo of me when I was really young with my grandma. My grandma was a Palestinian refugee who resettled in the country of Jordan. On your screen, you also see kind of a map of the Levant region of the Middle East. And so you can see there. And my father was born in this refugee camp. Later on, the family was able to move to an apartment in Eastern Amman, where lots of my family still lives. But growing up, my grandma would come to visit me in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where Grader's Ice Cream is from. But also on your screen, there's the photo of kind of the cityscape of Cincinnati. But growing up, early on, I had this sense that stories were how we can communicate identity, because my grandmother would tell me these stories about the home that she had lost, about the new home that she had made. And then she would ask me to tell her stories about my life in Ohio and my home in America. And even before I could read or I could write on my own, I was listening to her stories and I was telling stories of my own. And I was thinking about how stories can convey these ideas of identity and belonging. And those are themes that I return to over and over again in my work. It was in first grade that I first learned the word author. And this might seem like a little bit of a silly thing to share, but I think it's an important one too, because up until that moment in my life, it had never occurred to me that it was a job to create books. That was unfathomable to me to believe. I thought books kind of magically appeared. And when I learned that that was something that you could do, that you could spend your life working with stories and creating stories, I instantly seized onto that word and I held onto it so tight for so many years, knowing that's what I wanted to do. But this was complicated by a lot of things. My parents weren't that enthusiastic about the idea of me wanting to be an author. And it isn't at all because they didn't love me or believe in me or want me to be happy, but more that we didn't know anyone who was an author. When I was your age, author didn't come to my school. And my idea of who an author wasn't someone who really looked like me or came from a background like mine or was going to tell stories like the type of stories that I wanted to tell. And so I think it took me a long time to really believe that it would be possible for someone like me to become an author. But around this time when I learned author, when this dream was first kind of seeded in me, was also the period in my life when my dad became a naturalized citizen of the United States. And so here's a photo of me at author's night in first grade around this time when I learned this word. And even though I think the story that I wrote was a slightly magical story about psychic twins, it also, when I look through it, has a lot of kind of questions in there about identity, about what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a citizen? And I think these were things that I was really working through when I was in early elementary school, in part because like I said, I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. I actually grew up in a small town a little bit outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, that wasn't particularly diverse. I was the only student in my elementary school who had an immigrant parent, and I was the only student at my school who came from a Muslim family. And so early on, I was asked a lot of questions like, what are you and what do you believe? And I think when I was young, I didn't quite have the emotional vocabulary to answer those questions fully. And I didn't understand really why I was being asked those questions. And my friend next to me was not being asked those same questions. And I really wanted to fit in. I really wanted to belong. And so I think I was really wondering, a lot about what does it mean to belong and what does it mean that some of my family is from here in Ohio, but another big part of my family is from the Middle East, and how do I reconcile those two identities? So now I kind of want to switch gears and we're going to come back to those questions I just raised about identity and belonging, because they factor hugely into how I kind of went about writing Other Words for Home. But I kind of want to take all of you through the process of how does a book get made while using Other Words for Home as the framework for this, because this is something else that I frequently get asked by kids, is kind of what is the process for making a book. And so the first thing which may seem pretty obvious to a lot of you, is that you need an idea. And for me, my ideas kind of come from everywhere. When I talk to young writers today, so many people tell me, well, I want to write, but I don't have any ideas. And the thing is that all of us have ideas. I think we just live in a world now where it can be even harder than it used to come up with ideas, because we live in a world that doesn't really let us be bored, right? We can quickly grab for our phone and scroll through it and play a game. But I always get all of my best ideas when I'm paying attention to the world, where I'm being curious about it. I have these silly clip arts here kind of showing that idea of, paying attention to the world, being curious about it, asking big questions about the world, and also the news. I do get kind of a lot of ideas from the news, which may be kind of obvious when you look at the topic of Other Words for Home, but it's less kind of big national news and also more local interest stories. Like I listen to a lot of public radio, and I love listening to stories about humans, particularly young humans doing incredible things, and I'm remembering that, and that will kind of get my brain working, and an idea will stick in there. And so for Other Words for Home, the idea first came to me in August of 2013, which is a long time ago. And so if you can hold that date in your brain, because I'm going to show you kind of how long a book can live in your head before you even start working on it. But what happened in August 2013, you see Cincinnati here again. I was at home. I went home to visit my parents. And on this visit home, we went over to dinner at our family friend's house. So growing up, our closest family friends were Syrian American. So like I already shared, my own family is Palestinian Jordanian American. But growing up, we were very close with this family that's Syrian American. And so it wasn't unusual for me on a visit home to go over to this family's house for dinner. But what was different about this dinner was I was introduced to all of these members from their family that I had never met before, who had just come over to America from Syria because of the growing conflict there. And now in August of 2013, the conflict in Syria hadn't reached the boiling point that it eventually did. It wasn't yet labeled, the Syrian civil war. It was more kind of, you were hearing kind of whispers of it. It was more of an unrest. It hadn't reached the point where it was being covered in Western media. You didn't turn on CNN, you didn't read the New York Times and hear about Syria. But I guess what got me wondering was less about kind of the geopolitical situation in Syria and more this relationship that I was watching unfold between the cousins who had been born here in America and their cousins who had been born over in the Middle East. And so it made me start to wonder what it would have been like for me when I was in seventh or eighth grade if my cousins from Jordan or my cousins from Jerusalem had moved over to Cincinnati and moved in with my family, what that would have been like for me. Because at that time period in my life, I was really insecure in my own identity and had lots of really complicated feelings about it. And what would it have been like if they'd come to live with us? And if you've already read the book, if you've read Other Words for Home, you may be thinking, that sounds like a novel about Jude's cousin, Sarah. So in Other Words for Home, the main character's name is Jude, and she's the character who moves over from Syria. But her American cousin, Sarah, is a big character in the book and is almost the antagonist of the book. And you'd be right. Initially, I really thought it was Sarah's story, but ideas take a long time. So for me, for my process, I'll get an idea, but I daydream about that idea for months before I even begin to write. So I always get asked, do you plan out your novels? Do you outline them? And I'm not an outliner, I'm not a planner, but I am a daydreamer and a brainstormer. So I'm always I have this idea, right? And I'm wondering about it. And so this idea I was wondering about was, what would it be like for this family if members of their family who lived overseas came and moved in with them? And that's what I was brainstorming about. And I was kind of drawing pictures. I have tons of notebooks on my desk. I draw lots of pictures. A big part of my process is actually drawing, even though I'm not a professional illustrator by any means, but it's a way for me to kind of get out these ideas. And so I spend months kind of brainstorming about it. And as I was doing this, the Syrian conflict started to worsen. It was covered more and more by the American media, and suddenly lots of kind of the American kind of political conversation turned to this idea of refugees. And I started feeling really upset about the reaction I was seeing so many people have, particularly people in my neighborhood, people I felt close to, neighbors, even some friends or people I considered to be friends, were having to the idea of welcoming people who are fleeing from Syria, fleeing from the conflict. And I was wondering, why was there so much fear and why was there so much kind of fear and resentment and even hatred towards these people, particularly children who were trying to flee from this conflict. And I started thinking about all of the misconceptions so many Americans hold about the Middle East and about the religion of Islam. So I want to be really careful here that not everyone who lives in the Middle East is Muslim or practices Islam. It's the dominant religion in the region. And I think that the way the American news covers it is through this lens. So that's where I'm leading with here. But there definitely is religious diversity in the Middle East. There are Christians and there are Jews and there are other religious denominations. But I think the way that we cover the Middle East, particularly in American media, is particularly through this lens of it being, the Islamic world. And I think that the way that we cover it is always as a region in conflict, in war. And so when I was your age, I never really saw the Middle East in books or in media. As I got older, I started to, and it was always with this idea of being the enemy combatant, right? Of being a place of conflict and violence. And if we only ever see a region through that lens, if we only ever see a part of the world and people who live there through this lens of it being a place of violence or conflict, we start to believe something about the people that live there, right? And we start to have only one idea about them. And I started to realize that I think so much of this kind of skewed media representation was contributing to all of the fear so many Americans held about the idea of helping to resettle um, people who are fleeing from the conflict in Syria. And as I thought about this, I was thinking about the way the refugee crisis was being covered in our media and how kind of faceless our media was making this conflict out to be. So Jude, who's the main character of Other Words for Home, is one of 6.7 million refugees created by the Syrian civil war. And that's a mind-boggling number, right? That's a really hard number to hold in our head. And I think it can be really difficult to remember that every single one of those 6.7 million is a person who has a very particular and unique story, who has lost probably family members or friends and has left their whole home behind and has hopes and dreams of their own and, has a favorite food and a favorite movie. And that's what books are so great at, right? That's the power of story, is by telling an individual story, we can bring kind of humanity to a issue that often loses its human face in the way that we cover it. And so I just like the idea of saying that a book is humanizing, because I think we should be able to see people, particularly children like Jude, as humans, but more that reading stories, particular stories about them, humanizes us as readers, right? It reminds us of that human element that someone like Jude is going through. And so I realized I wanted to write a story from Jude's perspective. I wanted to kind of give voice to a story like Jude's that I felt like was being lost in all of this noise that was kind of obscuring the bravery and the humanity in kids like Jude's story. But that required me to do a fair amount of research. So I started with interviewing the members of my family friends who had come over from Syria. And then from there was put into contact with other members of the Syrian refugee community in Cincinnati. And I'm so grateful to everyone who lent me their time and told me their story, and that I was hopefully able to bring out kind of that texture and that I wouldn't have been without them sharing their personal experiences with me. And, as I was writing the book, I was really kind of thinking about this idea of how can we celebrate our differences, but also really focus on the things that we all have in common. And so while most of you who read the book will come from a very different background than Jude, you probably never had a life experience like Jude. You probably are not the same race as Jude or practice the same religion as Jude, but you'll probably see parts of yourself in Jude because there are universal qualities of the human experience, right? And of being a kid. And that's what I really wanted to kind of ask those questions with this book of kind of what does your home mean to you? And what would it be like for you if you had to leave your home? And what would you want in a new home? And how would you want people to treat you in a new home? And so I think novels are really great as vehicles for asking questions. They don't necessarily provide answers, but I wanted to start that dialogue. I wanted to ask young readers to really try to imagine the experience of someone like Jude in a way that I felt like the way our news media was covering wasn't asking those same particular questions. And so I really sat down to actively start writing Other Words for Home in the summer of 2016. So as you can see, this book lived in my head for almost 3 whole years of brainstorming and daydreaming about it. And so I always like to share this because so much of writing is thinking. I get asked all the time, how much do you write and how frequently do you write? And obviously it's important to sit down at your desk and have that discipline part of the craft of actually writing. But so much of writing is just thinking about the world and wondering about the world and asking those big questions that I was talking about earlier. And so it takes me a long time to figure out kind of what questions I want my book to ask. And then I move into writing from there. And so while writing the book, I was thinking a lot about my own experiences as a kid growing up in this country as Arab and Muslim. And so while the book is not my personal story at all, as I've already shared, I'm not an immigrant, let alone a refugee. I was born here. I have not lived the experience of someone like Jude. I think a lot of the identity questions that Jude goes through in the book of kind of what does it mean to be Arab and American? What does it mean to be Muslim and American are things that I grappled with a lot as a young person. So I was in 8th grade when 9/11 happened. And like the rest of my classmates, I was devastated that day. I was really afraid. I was worried for our country. But I came back to school the next day and suddenly realized I was being put in this different bucket, that suddenly everyone at my school was talking about the region of the world where a lot of my family was from. They were talking about the religion my family practiced, and they were saying like really awful things, things that I didn't believe to be true, but I also didn't have any media that told a different story. I felt like suddenly now I was the enemy and I was the problem. And I felt like these parts of my identity were in conflict, right? That I could be American or I could be Arab, and I could be Muslim or I could be American. In other words, for home was kind of my way of pushing back against this false idea that I held when I was 13 and when I was 14 and all the way through high school, this idea that somehow I had to get rid of these one part of myself in order to be American. And I hope that Other Words for Home in lots of ways is asking this bigger question of what is an American identity? And aren't so many of us who are American, don't we have hyphenated identities? And isn't that kind of the beauty and power of an American identity? And again, I don't think the book necessarily has one secure answer to what is an American identity, but it's asking you to think about those ideas and how there is beauty and power in hyphenated identities. So I spent most of the summer of 2017, well, 2016, and then also 2017, drafting and writing and working with my editor. This is a photo of her, Alexandra Balzar at HarperCollins. She's my editor, and we are going back and forth. And basically what happens is I will turn in a draft, and then she writes me a letter that says everything that is wrong with the book. So that letter might start as kind of an 11-page single-spaced letter, and I then try to fix all of her concerns. And maybe the next time she sends me back an 8-page single space letter with everything that's wrong with the book. And then maybe the next time a 5-page, and the letters get shorter and shorter and shorter. And so that's what was happening. And we were starting to feel really good about the book. It was almost at the point where it was going to go off to copy editing, which is kind of that final phase that a book goes through before it gets published. But something about the book just didn't feel right to me, and I didn't know how to fix it. My editor had done her job. She had kind of asked all the right questions about the book, and the plot structure was solid, and it was an okay book. It was maybe even a good book, but I really wanted this book to feel special. And I had this idea of how the book would be, and it wasn't matching this image I had in my head. And then I had this light bulb moment that really the book needed to be in verse. And so for those of you who have read Other Words for Home, you know that it's a book that's told in poems. So every single chapter is a different free verse poem. But initially the book wasn't in verse. For those first 4 or 5 drafts, it was a book that was in prose, which when I say prose, that's kind of what I mean by like what you think of as your standard book, like chunks of text in paragraphs. But I ended up rewriting the whole book in verse. And looking back on it now, I think that the book was really well suited to being in verse because while it's a book that's told in English, I was able to capture some of the cadence and texture and lyricality of Arabic by putting it into verse. I also think verse is a mode that really lets the character's emotions be the star of the show and the character's voice. And so for a book like Other Words for Home, that's a relatively quiet book. It's really about Jude's personal emotional experience with this kind of upheaval in her life. Verse is a form that works really well. Verse might not be the best form, right? If I ever decide that I want to write like a multi point of view, really meaty fantasy novel. Verse might not be able to hold that, right? Because it's something where you really have to pare down the language. There's this quote that I love that a friend of mine actually recently shared with me, and I can't find who originally said this quote, but um, it is that poetry is the compression of language, but the expansion of meaning. And I definitely feel like that's true of verse form. So you have less words overall in the book, but kind of each word matters more. And so you have to really think about that as a writer, where you're putting the words and kind of what meaning you want the reader to take from them. So then the book finally went off to copyediting, that stage that it was about to go off to before I decided to rewrite the whole book in verse. And then a year after that, it was published. So it was published in May of 2019. So that meant if I had the idea in August 2013, that was about 6 years of thinking and brainstorming and really working on the book. And so the idea here, right, is that books can take a really, really long time, but it's worth it. So these are some of the photos of kind of the fun part of publishing, which is after the book comes out and you're done with it. So it's a photo of me at a poster banner that my publisher made for the book at one of the kind of industry conferences, and then photo of me getting to do school visits, and then really special to me, a photo of one of my own kids with the book, because in lots of ways I wrote the book for them, that I wanted them to at least have one book on their bookshelf that really told kind of a different story about the Middle East and a different story about Muslim Americans that I felt had been told in books for young people for so long, kind of the book that I didn't find on a shelf when I was a young person and had all of those questions about my own identity. And then kind of you start all over again. So I'm going to talk really, really briefly here about my other two middle grade novels and kind of not go through this whole process, but kind of show how both of them also kind of started from this idea that grew in my brain. So The Shape of Thunder is always a really difficult book to talk about. It's a particularly difficult book to talk about today in light of the terrible news of what happened in Texas yesterday. And kind of that news and seeing that type of news light up my phone all the time was the impetus for writing this book. So The Shape of Thunder is a novel about two girls who are grieving in the aftermath of a school shooting in their small Ohio town. And the book kind of started from a really personal place for me as a mother. So this is a photo of my two daughters. At the time I started working on the book, neither of them was in school yet, but my oldest one was going to be starting kindergarten soon. And it came to my attention that the school across the street from us, where she would be going to elementary school, was having a lockdown drill. And I started thinking about how I didn't know how I was going to talk to my little girl about lockdown drills and about why we have lockdown drills and about why this is the solution that we've come up with. And so I was thinking about this kind of violence and how we have all kind of normalized this violence and the way us grown-ups have really failed young people around this issue. And so again, it's about to ask lots of questions about how do we kind of move forward? How do we make a better world? How do we live through the impossible? It's a book about grief and it's a book about friendship. And like I said, I think it's a book that asks lots of really difficult questions, but I wanted to provide a forum for us all to have this conversation, because that's what I think books are really great at, is helping us to talk about things that can make us really uncomfortable. And when I was your age, I sought out books for that reason. I sought out books to help me to reconcile things about our world that bothered me or made me think or made me upset or kind of caused anxiety for me. And I turned to books for that. And so my biggest hope with this book is that it would help broker some of those really difficult conversations. And then kind of on a completely sort of opposite topic of kind of how books come to you in all sorts of ways, I talked about how Other Words for Home, I had to do a lot of research interviewing members of the Syrian refugee community in Cincinnati, Ohio. But for my book that's coming out this fall, I had to do a whole other host of research. So my novel that comes out this fall is narrated by a Mars rover. My publisher's kind of calling it, for those of you who've read, like the one and only Ivan, but with robots. And so I had to learn everything that I could about Mars rovers. And then I had to take all of the research and kind of use my imagination to create this voice for this robot. And so while this book sounds probably so different from my other two books, I think at its heart, it's still really a book about home and belonging and resilience, who you see here on the cover, who's the Mars rover. He wonders a lot about what home is and where he belongs. And he wonders a lot about human emotions. That's a big thing that runs through him. He's a slightly anxious little rover, and he wonders a lot about those things. And so I think, well, it's coming at kind of these same it's coming at these same questions, but from a very different angle. The book was inspired by my daughter, who loves space, and kind of encouraged me to watch the latest Mars rover launch with her. And while we were watching it, asked me the question. She said, "Mom, do you think the robot is scared?" And from there, I kind of saw the story. I started wondering about, what does it mean to be scared, and what does it mean to do something that scares you, even when you are scared, and all of those types of questions. So that is my new book that comes out this fall. But now I would love kind of to take any questions that anyone might have about um, anything that I just talked about.
All right. Well, I think I can kick us off with some questions that got sent in advance by Parkrose Middle School. So I'll start with one of those. And Parkrose Middle School students ask, have you ever been to the Middle East? And if so, where and what was it like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So growing up, we went to Jordan almost every summer, and so I would stay with family members, primarily in Amman, but I've been all over the country of Jordan. I've never been anywhere else in the Middle East, even though I would really, really like to. I particularly would really love to visit the West Bank, where I still have family, and I'd also would love to someday get to see Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, and lots of other countries in the region. But what was it like? As a kid, I think that it was a funny thing of how in my small town, I really felt so different from everyone else, but then I never felt kind of more American than those summers in Jordan with my cousins there.
Oh, and I should say again that for everybody who did not send questions in advance, please go ahead and type those questions that you're probably thinking of right now into the chat. And if you want to say what school you're from, if you are from a school, then go ahead and do that, and we will grab those questions out of the chat and ask them. But in the meantime, while we are waiting for more of those questions to come in, I'll do another of the Parkrose students' questions, which is, do you have a preferred genre of writing you like?
That's a good question. So, I used to say probably like realistic fiction, contemporary fiction, because so many of my books started out that way. And I think I am always primarily the most interested sort of in emotions, which oftentimes then leads to contemporary fiction, I guess. But as I get into this more, I find myself edging more and more toward the speculative. And I wonder if that's sort of me stretching myself as right. I read in all genres. So I love, all genres. I get asked kind of a similar question to this is always, are you going to ever write a graphic novel? I love graphic novels. I love reading graphic novels. I just haven't yet had the opportunity to write one, which is kind of how I feel about like a fantasy or a more straightforward science fiction novel. Though I guess the Rover book kind of is science fiction. Though it's funny, I think of it as also a realistic book. So I would say probably most of my books have been realistic fiction so far, but I'm not so sure how much of that is that being my preferred genre and that being the genre that I like figured out so far. And I would like to kind of expand out.
All right. Let's see. Looking at the chat. Oh, from Alice at Middle School. What is your writing routine, and do you work every day in a certain place?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So my ideal writing routine is that I wake up in the morning, we do like the normal family rush of, can we get everyone ready to get to school on time, get everyone to school. And then I write in the morning. And then in the afternoons, I do all the other parts of my job that aren't writing, actual like writing, creating writing, more just like answering emails or figuring out presentations or whatever it might be. Because I find my creative brain works best in the morning, but that's always like the ideal situation, which oftentimes doesn't happen. Sometimes, your morning time is eaten up by other things and you have to write in the afternoon. And I think one of the best things that's ever happened to me is really early on, before I was published, when I was trying to write, I was a teacher and I used to wake up really early every morning and I would drive to my classroom before my students got there and I would write in the morning. So I think that cultivated that early morning writing, but I also think it taught me how to like write in kind of the crevices of my everyday life. And so not to be too precious about a certain routine. Like I'm zooming to you right now from my writing office. And so that's my like preferred space. But I've had to learn, how to write in a hotel room when you're, doing school visits, or how to sometimes write downstairs when the pandemic is happening. And so your partner is doing a very like loud work meeting in what used to be your work office. And so all of those things I've had to learn how to kind of be more flexible. I know it was saying like the question of every day. And so I when I'm drafting something, I try to at least tap in with the project, because I find like even if I can just write a couple of words in the document, I stay like in that world. But I'm definitely a big believer, as I talked about in my presentation, of that so much of writing is also like gathering and thinking and daydreaming. So there are periods where I'm not actively writing. And sometimes that's like weeks and weeks.
All right, we got another one from Alice at middle school. What advice do you have for students that want to be authors?
Yeah, so my advice is always really simple, but I honestly think it is the truest advice, which is to read, and to read as much as you possibly can. The best way to get better at writing is through reading. And read in the more you read, the more you're going to start to be able to look at a book and think about, well, why did I like this book? What was so compelling to me about this book that I couldn't put it down? And you'll start to develop your taste too, because I think all of us, when we first start out writing, we kind of gravitate towards a certain style. And I know for me, I kind of imitated my favorite writers before I found my own voice, but it was from reading that I sort of figured out kind of what I wanted my voice to sound like and what kind of stories I was interested in telling. And I always kind of think of writing as a conversation. And so that reading part is that listening part, so that you kind of feel inspired to know what you want to say, what you want to add to the conversation. And the other part is to write. So I know that sounds so easy. I'm telling you to read and to write, but truly that's it. And if you write, you're a writer, and the more that you do it, the better you're going to get at it. Writing's a muscle, and kind of the more you practice and the more you work it, the better you're going to get at it. And so I always just emphasize writing. And I think that when I was young, I always wanted to write like a novel. And so I would never finish anything. And so my big advice for younger writers is to maybe tackle smaller projects, because learning how to finish is a really important skill. And it's something I still struggle with today. And sometimes I'll turn to being like, okay, I'm just going to work on a short story because I need to remember, how to finish something.
All right. Well, the chat is piling up with questions, so gonna keep going right on with it. From Kellogg Middle School, why did you end Other Words for Home like a cliffhanger?
Yeah, so that's a great question. That I only now understand that the ending is viewed as a cliffhanger from having now heard from so many young readers about that. I like ambiguous endings of novels. It's like a reading taste thing of, I kind of feel like a book is sort of a snapshot in time, and we understand that the story goes on and there was more story before it, but you're kind of picking this snapshot in time to tell your story. And so not everything that has happened in the story, right, is going to be neatly tied up, because that's not how life is, right? If I tell you a story about your seventh grade year, there are probably going to be lots of things that are unresolved by the time the school year ends, that we'd still be wondering about, what's going to happen with your relationship with this friend, or what might happen on this trip that you were planning, or so and so. But after having gotten this reader sense, I now am looking at all of my endings with an extra eye towards trying to make sure it doesn't seem so much like the book just cuts out. For me, I viewed it as Jude is stepping onto the stage and stepping into her own power, and has finally learned to feel comfortable and know that her voice matters. And to me, that was the place that I really wanted to end her in, because that felt like a completion of her arc, of this question she'd had of, can I be seen in America? Can I be heard in America? And I felt like the book answered the question from that moment, but I definitely see and hear all of you who think that it was very ambiguous. And I guess the only thing that I can say, which I know is not very satisfying, but is that the characters really belong to you now. And so any ending that you want to imagine for them and other possibilities are totally yours to imagine and as valid as anything I could imagine in my head.
All right. Zahir from Jackson Middle School asks, what kind of books would you write in the future?
Well, I said, like, I'm interested maybe in moving in a more speculative direction. I'm also really interested in format. I feel like we're in this really exciting period where we're really asking this question of like, what is a novel and what can a novel look like? And you see that with graphic novels with graphic elements, but also just other formats, with the rise of verse novels becoming more popular, but also just looking at kind of how can you tell the story maybe with like mixed media type objects. So I think that's something that's on my brain a lot. But um, right now I'm working on a project that's about a summer trip to Jordan. So kind of related to the question I was asked about the Middle East.
Right. Um,
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead. Let's see. Next up, we've got from Kellogg Middle School, if the Civil War happened in the fall, why are snowflakes falling in the book?
Okay, so the period that the book takes place in is not like one specific moment. So the conflict in Syria is actually still going on, and so the timeline in the book is purposely ambiguous. So Jude is from a town, it's based on the same small town that my family friends are from, where the conflict really escalated at a specific period in time in the Syrian Civil War, but I didn't name the town for that specific reason of wanting it to feel more fluid because her story could still be happening today. There's tons of Syrian refugees who are still waiting to be rehomed, who are still fleeing from Syria. And so it's an ongoing conflict and problem. So I wanted the book to feel fluid in that way and not bound in a way that felt historical, but more this understanding that this is an ongoing conflict and that kids are still going through what Jude is going through today.
All right. From Park Rose, and you spoke a little bit to this when you were talking about revisions, but Nora wants to know, how many drafts have you written for the book?
For Other Words from Home, it's tricky because as I know, you write so many drafts before you show them, you should even show it to your editor. And so I would say I had written through maybe 2 to 3 drafts of the book before I sent it off to my editor. And then her and I there was about another 4 drafts of the book through editing with her before I decided to turn the book into verse, and then another 3 to 4 drafts once the book got turned into verse. But some of those were more heavy rewrites than others. So obviously when I rewrote the whole book in verse, that's a whole rewrite of your basically scrapping everything. Whereas once the book was in verse and we were going through it, it was more like deleting certain sections and writing new poems for that type of writing. But writing really is rewriting. And I think that's always something like that I've been surprised by, but I think that my writing improved the most once I learned to kind of really embrace revision and embrace this idea that it's really through like bold revision that books can really be teased out.
Right. Alice at Middle School asks, after accomplishing your dreams of writing, do you have any other dreams, and what encourages you to write?
That's a great question. So I think the dream is to get to keep doing this, which always doesn't seem, it's not as guaranteed as you may believe. It's always, am I going to be able to write another book? And am I going to be able to find someone who's enthusiastic enough about that book to want to read it? And I think that what keeps me going is getting to talk with young readers like all of you and hearing kind of what books mean to you and how stories influence you and shape you. And I had a particularly moving school visit recently where I got to meet with like the Muslim Student Association and just hearing from kids who felt really, really seen in this book in a way that they hadn't felt seen before. That really motivates me to want to keep telling stories and populating stories with diverse characters, and more than that, uplifting the books of other writers who are working today to making sure that all of you see yourself in books and stories.
Love that. You kind of spoke to this too in saying that like the characters belong to everyone now, but Alice Ott asks, will you consider writing a sequel to Other Words for Home? If so, we will read it.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. So, um, I always thought that I would write a companion book to Other Words for Home that would actually be from Sarah's perspective, because as I said in the presentation early on, I thought the book was going to be Sarah's book. And I think it's interesting how she really is the antagonist of Other Words for Home. And I think it'd be really interesting to write a book from her perspective. But I've been so lucky that Other Words for Home has found the audience that it's had. So now I feel like my publisher would be very enthusiastic if I told them I wanted to do a companion book, but I feel like I only want to do it if I feel like it's a story that really, really needs to be told and would really, really be a solid story that's deserving of readers and not just a way to kind of retread the same themes. So I would have to figure out kind of what I want to say with the book and those big questions that I want to ask with the book and make sure it feels distinct enough that while it would be connected, it could stand on its own. And I really haven't figured that out. So I don't want to say never say never. It's something I think about a lot and would love to figure out how to do, but I would want to be able to do it in a way to me that felt really authentic. Like this is the book that I should be writing and I want to be writing, not that this is the book that makes like the most marketing sense to write.
Got it. Okay, now important question from Simon at Park Rose. Do you play video games?
That is a very important question. So I'm going to date myself here and say that when I was growing up, the like system that I played on was an N64. And so I've been very excited when our household got a Nintendo Switch and a lot of those games that I knew from my youth came back. But I'm not like a gamer in the way that like I know actual video gamers are, because I am married to one. And so I know that I'd not fall into that realm of being able to speak that language or know, but I'm more like a enthusiastic on a weekend night Mario Kart, Mario Party player.
All right, I'm going to skip around a little bit to make sure we get some of these that have been coming in the last couple minutes. Let's see, from Floyd Light, do you ever get writer's block? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so this is always tricky, right? Because writing is kind of, like I said, it's kind of a discipline craft. So there's a little bit piece of it where it's like every time I sit down to write, I'll find a way to procrastinate. So you always feel a little bit stuck because it's like you have to get into it and it is hard work. I assume this is the way it is like for people who run. I don't run, but like I've heard that said, and it's like you never want to like do it. And then once you do it, you feel better. And that's kind of how it is for me with writing. I always am happy after I've written, but I never feel like it's really going that great or that easily when I'm actually kind of fighting through it. But there are moments when you actually do get stuck. You can call it what you want to call it, like if it's stuck or blocked. For me, I kind of call it that I know the story has taken a wrong turn. So since I don't outline my books and I kind of the first draft is this like messy exploration, lots of times what I have to do is I have to take a step back and then I kind of have to like refill my inspiration well. So I take a long walk with my dog, I listen to music, I read other books. And finally, once I feel like I'm in a better headspace, that at least in theory, I'm excited again about the idea of writing, I go back and I read through the whole document from beginning to where I'm at. And I flag the last place in the book where I feel like I could write from there. And so oftentimes I lose a lot of pages, but it just means that I kind of somewhere along the way kind of wrote myself into a corner when I got stuck. So that's kind of my trick that I do, because I don't believe in like grinding it out when you know that it like doesn't feel right. But for me, it's always so tricky to know like, is that it actually doesn't feel right? Or am I just like trying to find a way to not have to like work through whatever the problem is?
Now we have more of a publishing question. Who made, and this is from Alice Ott, who made the cover of the book? How did you choose what to put on the cover? And how long did it take to make?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I don't have anything to do with the covers. That's actually sort of a team of people. So there's a job at my publishing house called an art director. And what the art director does is she reads all of the books that the publisher is going to be publishing, and she kind of starts to think about what would be a good cover, because the cover is sort of a marketing tool, right? The idea of the cover is the publisher wants you, when you go to the library, when you go to the bookstore, to gravitate to that book, to want to pick it up and kind of flip through it and learn more about it. So what they start by doing is thinking, well, what books is this book similar to that have already been published? And what do the covers look like for those books? And like have those covers worked well? How can we make our cover seem unique and stand out, but maybe pull some of those elements to kind of um, draw in those same type of readers. And so she'll kind of have an idea, and then she hires an illustrator, and it's the illustrator who really brings the book to life. And so for this cover, for Other Words for Home, it was done by a Pakistani Canadian illustrator called Anusha Syed, who I think did a beautiful, beautiful job with the cover and really brought you to life in a way that I couldn't have imagined. My covers always surprise me because I never think they're going to look the way they look. And then I'm always really delighted by kind of the illustrator's interpretation of the book. But I got really emotional when I saw the cover for the first time because I really couldn't have imagined finding a book with that cover in my middle school library when I was your age. And so it was really exciting to see Jude like that on the cover of the book. But that's all Jenna and Anusha and not me at all, which is why I can say that I just totally love it and really, really, really love the cover and proud of the cover.
All right. Well, this question has come in from a couple folks, and I know that this is a hard question to answer. So a couple of people want to know, what is your favorite book that you've written?
Yeah, so I always kind of, and I know this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I always see it's my most recent book because I think I'm always trying to grow as a writer and I'm always excited about whatever creative kind of itch that I was scratching with my most recent book. So I'm really excited. My favorite book right now is my book that comes out in October, A Rover Story, because it's my first sort of semi-speculative novel. It's my first novel with a non-human narrator. It felt very different working on it than any of my other books. But, you know, if I'm lucky enough to visit your library system in a couple of years, I would probably pick whatever my most recent book is. But that said, you know, Other Words for Home has just been such a special experience for me personally, of just like, I never would have imagined that the book would be able to reach the amount of kids that it has. In part because I think like I had learned to erase myself. And while I was even working on the book, I was like, this book is too Arab or too Muslim. And so to see the kind of widespread appreciation for the book it's been really like emotional for me and really special. And so I think I'll always have like a special like gratitude to the book for that. But I'm always the most excited about my book that is on the horizon.
Got that. All right. A couple related ones from Parkrose, and I think you kind of answered Josiah, who asked, how do you feel that multiple people like your story? And then Noah asks, have you ever had a moment where you thought your book wouldn't make it?
Yeah, I definitely do. You know, Other Words for Home, initially my publisher didn't want the book. So they had been my publisher for my first two books, and I love my editor. But the publishing team really wanted another YA book, which is like kind of means that it should be for high schoolers. And so they really wanted to age up the book and they wanted to add in like a romance. And I really felt like Jude to me was 12 years old and this was a junior high story. And it felt so strongly to me that that's how it was. But there was a moment where it really was unclear whether they were going to accept it as a middle grade book. And then there have been lots of other, you know, I was rejected. I always share on school visits. Was rejected over 217 times before I found a literary agent. So there's lots of stories that I've written and tried to publish that have not been published, and since being published that I wanted to publish that people have not been interested in, or I haven't been able to figure out how to work. So I definitely feel like a part of a creative career is, you know, hearing no a lot of times, but learning how to really cherish those yeses and seize them and keep going in spite of them. And also kind of knowing when to push and when to give up on something, which is something that I think it can be hard to know, you know, when is the moment that you have to let go of this project and when is the moment to kind of fight for it. But there have been times when there's lots of times that you can easily be disappointed by things, but also I've been really, really lucky. And so I hold on to that too.
Awesome. I think we've got time for maybe just a couple more questions, and I'm looking through the chat. Let's see. Oh, and Maya asks from HV Lee, who are some other YA authors you like or admire?
Oh, that's a really nice question. So one of my favorite authors is Jacqueline Woodson. So when I was teaching middle school right after I graduated from college, I would read aloud to my students all the time. And from doing that, discovered all this these books that have been published for middle schoolers since I've been a middle schooler, and my brain like blew up in the best possible way. And Jacqueline Woodson's books were some of those books of being like, wow, this is like so amazing. And it really put it together for me that I wanted to write for young people. I also really love Lisa Moore Romey's middle grade novels. So she wrote a novel called A Good Kind of Trouble, and has a new middle grade novel that's actually a fantasy that's coming out this fall called Map Maker. And then another one of my really favorite writers working in middle grade today, her name is Mariama Lockington, and she's was a poet. And I think you see that in her books that sometimes combine verse and sometimes are in prose, but they feel really lyrical. And she has a new book called In the Key of Us, that's about two girls kind of falling in love at summer camp. And I love the book. And it has poems from the perspective of the summer camp, which I thought was like really like clever and so well done. So those are like the ones that just come to mind. But as I'm sure you know, I could just like go on and on and on because I admire so many people who are working today and writing books for young people. I think it's a really special moment to be working for kids right now.
All right, well, let's see. We had a couple kind of language related questions. Somebody asked about if you were ever bullied for not knowing English. And then we had another question about how many languages you speak.
Yeah, so I was never bullied for not knowing English because I've never not known English. So English is my first language, and that's like an enormous privilege living here in America to have that. Growing up, I am really ashamed to say that there were many moments where I was really embarrassed by my dad's accent and would get really frustrated when I felt like I did translate these people couldn't understand him. And those are moments now that I'm so sad that my feeling was to be ashamed as opposed to having more patience, and like how amazing it is that he is fluent in both of those languages, which is not something I can say for myself. My Arabic is nowhere near being fluent. So in terms of what languages I speak, I would say English is really the only language that I speak really well that we could be having this level of conversation in. And Arabic and Spanish are languages where I can speak enough of them to maybe navigate an airport, but not having a complicated like intellectual conversation.
All right, let's see. This is also, I know that we have a little event evaluation, and if some of my awesome colleagues could paste that into the chat, that would be fabulous. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more in our last couple minutes. So Gentry from Park Rose asks, has anyone tried to take advantage of your work?
I don't quite know like exactly what you mean by that question. If you mean, has anyone, I think that that's a difficult question. That's a really smart question. And it's a really difficult question to answer because I feel so lucky to have gotten to have the publishing team that I have. I have a really wonderful editor who is a really big advocate for me and a really wonderful agent. And so I feel really well supported in that way. I think that sometimes you have to advocate for yourself, right, to avoid kind of being tokenized in spaces. And by that, I mean, I always worry that, I am Arab American and I am Muslim American, but I'm not the only Muslim American or the only Arab American. And we're not, a monolith. There's so much diversity within the community. And so it's not necessarily somebody taking advantage of my work, but I always worry about my work being held up as if you've read this book, that's the end. That's the only one that you have to read to understand this experience. And that's not the case at all. And so I always am a big advocate of wanting diversity within diversity. And so I think that's my only instances of ever feeling like that, where I'm asked to speak for an entire community. And I don't feel, qualified to do that or that I should be asked to do that. And so those would be moments where I felt that. But in general, I feel like I've been very, very lucky. And I know that not everyone has had that experience. And so I think that's a really smart and empathetic question of you to ask.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for these fabulous questions. I think that we can end it on a light note because we also had the what is your favorite animal question.
which is the best question. That is such an awesome question. So I'm gonna rule out cats and dogs because I feel like that's like I love pets, but my favorite animal is a walrus. I love walruses. I think they're so cute and so funny. And growing up, the Cincinnati Zoo had a walrus for a long time that I was really, really attached to. His name was Brutus, and I loved to go and visit Brutus. So love walruses.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you all so much for coming, asking such great questions. Thank you so much to Jasmine for your fantastic and thoughtful and inspiring presentation and answers. And as Allison put in the chat, you can find Jasmine's books in the library. And yeah, thanks everybody. Take care.